We're in the book of Esther, and last week we were noticing that the king threw a drunken party to show how powerful he was and all of his riches and all of that. We would remember that he called for his queen to come, and he wanted to show her off in some way. We don't know exactly how, but he was going to show her off, and she refused to come. What are we going to do? So his advisors told him to get rid of her. Make a decree that she cannot come in your presence anymore. In other words, kick her out of the queenship. And get another queen. Send all the provinces of the land and bring the most beautiful young virgins that you can and choose a queen from them. That's interesting. So what we're seeing today, beginning with verse 21, if you read along with me, and the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and it should be published according to the language of every people. So Memucan's advice was followed, and a decree was issued by the king, and it basically consisted of two parts. Number one, every man should bear rule in his own house. He was saying every man should have dominion in his own house, his own family. That dominion did not pass outside, except as far as the king was concerned, and law, etc. You take care of your own house, and you have the authority there, and you do as you're supposed, as we tell you to. The Septuagint version translates this, in order that men might be feared in their own houses. The word feared in the Hebrew, in the Septuagint version, remember this section is written in Aramaic, or not, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong book. I'm studying Daniel right now, and I keep thinking about a section that I'm studying. But in the Hebrew, this word feared refers basically to reverence. It has a little bit of fear involved with it, but if we read it that way, it makes a lot more sense to us. In order that men might be reverenced in their own houses. And the second part of this decree that he issued was that it should be published according to the language of every people. And what this shows us is their country, that empire, was made up of so many nations and things. They had to publish things in the language of all the others to make sure that they all understood it. That causes a lot of confusion in nations. Here in the United States, we have not had that confusion so much because one language. But that's been changing over the last few years, and now people are demanding, oh, you put it in this language and you put it in that, and you've probably gotten directions to either something to put together or in some medicine that you bought or some other thing that you'll see, oh, there's 3 languages here. Oh, there's 4 languages. And we're headed for a lot of confusion in this country because of that. But look at Esther chapter 2 now, and let's look at verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what was decreed against her. Chapter 1 basically dealt with the disposal of Vashti as Ahasuerus' queen. Showed us the power of Ahasuerus, showed us his wealth, etc. But chapter 1 began in what we recognize as the 3rd year of Ahasuerus' reign. According to verse 16 of this chapter begins with the 7th year of the king's reign. Notice that. There's 4 years difference between chapter 1 and verse 22 and chapter 2 and verse 1. Well, what happened? What are these things that it talks about after these things? What happened is that Ahasuerus went to war with the Greeks. Now, this is not the one where Alexander defeated their armies, but he goes and fights against these Greeks. He decides, I want more territory. I want to conquer more lands. But he was defeated, and he lost a great part of his army and his fleet of ships. If you'll remember when we talked about earlier how nonsensical some of these rulers were, this is when he had the sea whipped because a storm came and destroyed all of his ships. He launched his campaign against Greece in 480 BC. And initially, they won some small victories and began to maybe think, oh man, nobody can stand in our path. And yet Jenny lets her phone ring in my class. That's my phone now. Initially, they won some small victories, probably began to think, oh, nobody can defeat us. These Greeks aren't anything to go against. But they were defeated decisively at a place called Plataea in 479 BC. And after Ahasuerus' wrath subsided because of this defeat, after he got back home, this is when he remembered Vashti. What did he remember? What she had done, what he decreed against her. And notice the next few verses seem to lend credence to the thought that I presented a while back, that he remembered her with fondness and regret. He regretted his actions. When people are a bunch of drunkards and in the throes of their alcohol, they do a lot of things that maybe later they regret. In fact, you don't even have to be drunk to regret things that you've done in the past, do you? We've all done things that we regret and wish we hadn't done. I believe when you look at the original language here and you start tearing that language apart and looking at the words and the verbs that are used, that he regrets what he did to her. It's hard to know with any kind of certainty, but I believe that that's the case. Look at verses 2 through 4. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, under the custody of Haggai, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. The king's servants. This goes back, I think, to what we saw in chapter 1, where they advised him, get these young women and bring them into the palace at Shushan. There were a number of palaces that they used, but this palace seems to have been where Ahasuerus, or rather, Ahasuerus was at that time of the year. And notice that these servants are the ones who are ministering to him daily. This is not the same servants here, but it goes back to their advice that were mentioned in chapter 1. These are the servants who took care of the king's personal needs, his food, did his laundry, all of these kinds of things. These were menial. It's interesting that this term, minister, the original term here, can also refer to a worshiper. And when we look at the kings of that time, basically they were worshiped. They often portrayed themselves as a god in their pantheon. Excuse me. So these servants probably saw a depression in the king due to his defeat by the Greeks. And they didn't like that, because if a person's depressed, usually they don't treat people who are around them very well, do they? And they knew that they probably knew that he had thought about Vashti, and maybe wishful thinking again, but it does seem to me there was a genuine bond between him and Vashti. The solution that had been offered by the officers of Ahasuerus had been: search through the kingdom, find the most beautiful virgins there are, have them brought, pick one, make her queen. Well, now his menial servants are telling him the same thing. I know it's kind of silly sometimes, but all of us can be depressed because of something. And I remember a time when I lost a cat that was more than just a cat. It was a service animal to me. And I got depressed and didn't realize it, but my family did. And so next thing I know, they're out saying, hey, you got to get another animal, not to replace that one, but because you need a cat to pet when you're feeling this way. And animals can sense that kind of a thing in a person, and they seem to know. Ahasuerus, from all appearances of the context, seems to have been depressed at this time. They're trying to find a way to get him out of this depression. Well, these young women were brought to the house of the women. Notice that, the house of the women. There seems to be two compartments to the king's harem. There was the king's harem proper, and there was the house of the women. Those who were prepared to go into his harem went to this particular place. And these young women would become concubines of the king or the queen. And by that, we're not talking about a sexual relationship between the queen and her, but between the king. But they would serve her because they were the concubines of the king. And once they were part of the king's harem, they would never leave. They could never marry somebody else. They could never be given in marriage unless the king, of course, was trying to arrange a treaty between himself and some others. Then he could give one of them to that king in exchange for someone for his family to unite the two families. Notice that each one of these women were given the things for purification. The word purification comes from the word tamrik. And what it's talking about are ointments and soaps and detergents to wash herself. And this was to be done for a year's time. And I've often thought about that and thought, man, that is strange. But at the same time, I understand a certain part of it. When I was in Vietnam, there were certain missions that when we went on them for a week ahead of time, we ate only the kinds of foods that our enemies would eat. And the reason for that was because the foods you eat will cause certain smells to emanate from your body, just through your sweat, etc. And so by having that, they couldn't smell us. And we couldn't smell them during those times because we smelled ourselves and we were eating the same food. But think about it, if it only took a week for us to get those smells out of our body, why were they doing it for a whole year? And you know, why the ointments and things to to eliminate some of these odors. But something about ointments may have something to do here. To some of these young women, notice no distinction had been made. It's just all the nation, from all the nation. Some of these may have been people who were involved in manual labor. It would take time to get rid of some of those calluses, etc. And ointments like this would help. And then you have the soaps and the detergents. And these odor or ointments that are mentioned here, they were been something like myrrh or sweet odors that from different plants and things that would be used. This was a tremendous business back in those days. We read of myrrh and some of these things being shipped, well, shouldn't say shipped, they don't do it like we do today, do they? Taken by camels and caravans to trade with the people. It's very big business. Now we need to consider that Ahasuerus and Esther's actions here are not condemned in this book. Isn't that interesting? Why? Think about it. Why? Because multiple wives were not condemned during that time by God. David was allowed to have multiple wives, and he did. And no condemnation, even though it was not God's plan from the beginning, God allowed certain things to take place, and it's not my business to try and figure out why he did it. But God allowed it. And kings of that time were allowed to have multiple queens and concubines. David had them, Solomon had them, many kings after those two had them. This book was designed to show what God providentially did to save his people from their being destroyed. That's what Esther is really all about. The seed line of Messiah had to be preserved. And even though God's people had turned against him, even though they had to be punished by going into this captivity, that seed line had to be preserved. And in that seed line, it had to be people who were directly related to David back through the genealogies. God's people are in danger in this captivity. We're going to see a number of times when the opportunity was provided for the enemies of God's people to try to destroy them. And one of the biggest ones is right here in the book of Esther. But God's seed line must be preserved. So we're seeing something that God did through his providence, and possibly even some miraculous activity, to preserve the seed line of Messiah. Look at verses 5 through 7. Now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shemiah, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter. For she had neither the father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took her for his own daughter. Search has been made throughout all the land for a queen. Interestingly, the search didn't need to go anywhere past the capital, Shushan. Didn't need to go any further. Didn't need to bring all these young women from all over the empire. The text now introduces us to the hero and the heroine of this book, Mordecai. Notice it says, it specifies a Jew. Mordecai. The politically correct crowd today will say, oh, you can't use the term Jew. I prefer to use the biblical term. Not as any put down of anyone, but they would want us to say Jewish. Notice it says that he was a Benjamite. Let's remind ourselves of something here. Let's remind ourselves of the events of the carrying away of the Jews to Babylon. Why? Because our text does. And let's think about the time frame. The first carrying away took place in 606 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. He had conquered many of the cities around Jerusalem. His armies were now stationed to conquer Jerusalem, but he did not conquer Jerusalem. When a lot of our brethren talk about Nebuchadnezzar and Jerusalem, they think of him conquering Jerusalem, but he did not conquer Jerusalem at this time. Instead, a treaty was made with him by the presiding king of Jerusalem, and in that treaty, part of the Jews were taken off into captivity. Why do you think that was? How better to make sure that somebody whom you've conquered obeys you than to take the children of your leaders into captivity? And the threat then always is what? You don't do what we say, guess what we're going to do to your children? So the first one took place in 606 BC. Jehoiakim, according to Daniel 1, verses 1 through 2, was the king on the throne. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were specifically mentioned in Daniel chapter 1 as being part of that group that was taken. The second carrying away took place in 597 BC. Here, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. But he did not destroy Jerusalem. He did not destroy their walls, the walls of the city, nor did he destroy the temple at this time. The king, Jehoiakim, or Jeconiah, better known as Jehoiakim. Notice the difference. Jehoiakim in Daniel 1, 1 through 2, here it's talking about Jehoiakim, also known as Jeconiah. You can read about that carrying away in 2 Kings chapter 24. The third carrying away occurred in 586 BC. Zedekiah was the king according to 2 Kings 25, 4 through 12. Now in this carrying away, this is when Nebuchadnezzar tore down the walls of the city, tore down the temple. Not done before this time. This time, basically, he said, I've had enough. You've rebelled against me and rebelled against me, and this is it. I'm going to destroy your city. And he did, including the temple. Took all the treasure out of it, took all of it back to Babylon, where he stored it, remember, in the temple of his god, his primary god, Marduk. And understand something. That was an honor. He was not denigrating the God of the Israelites. You have to remember and understand, he was a polytheist. Because he was a polytheist, the polytheist believed that you could worship any number of gods. You could choose which one was your favorite, and you could worship that God. To Nebuchadnezzar, to Ahasuerus, the God of Israel, the God of Daniel, the God of Mordecai, he was just one of many gods, just another God of many gods. And he would honor their gods, by placing the items that he took when he conquered them from their temples into the temple of his gods. And if you want a clear indication of that, turn over to Daniel and study it carefully. Because who was the last one mentioned in the book of Daniel? Do you remember? Anybody remember? Because I've forgotten. Belshazzar, thank you. Belshazzar was denounced by Daniel, who was telling him what the writing on the wall meant. And he says, you weren't like Nebuchadnezzar. You weren't as powerful, you weren't as strong, and you didn't learn from what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And what had Belshazzar done that occasioned God to cause a hand to write on the wall? Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Remember? He had caused the vessels of the temple to be brought from the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had placed in, and he was desecrating them by having the wine from his cellars poured into them, and they were drinking from them in their riotous behavior. Now, the timeline of our text, what we're looking at right now in Esther, is the second carrying away, after 597. It is said by historical books that when he tried to defeat the Greeks on his way home, that's when this took place. The carrying away, or the capture of Jehoiakim, and the carrying away of more people into his empire. Mordecai, notice, is a descendant of Kish of the tribe of Benjamin. It appears that it was a very common practice of the Babylonians to change the names of their captives. Now remember, Mordecai and Hadashish would have been carried into Babylonian captivity while Babylon was still in power. And their names are changed. And now we're introduced to the heroine of our text, Hadassah. That's her Jewish name. And that name means myrtle. Just the name itself, talking about one of these fragrant spices that was so valued in their time. I guess it'd be kind of like maybe Chanel No. 9 or something like that. That's all I can come up with in my mind. I don't care about that kind of stuff. And I'm glad Jenny doesn't wear it. A bunch of perfume. Butler tells us that this is a large evergreen shrub. And he says it has fragrant flowers on it. Obviously, these would be mashed up and turned into an oil or mixed with oils. And spicy, sweet-scented leaves. Esther is the Persian name that she was given. And interestingly, that's interesting to me because she has this name. Was she born after the Persians took control of the Babylonian kingdom? I don't know. But it means star. And she's going to be the star of this episode that is portrayed for us. Hatcher tells us that her Persian name is Esther, referring to the planet Venus. Well, Venus is a star, isn't it? We call it a planet a lot of times, but it's nothing more than basically what the stars are. So it kind of fits. Esther appears to have been orphaned at a very early age. She was Mordecai's cousin. When you study, again, the original, the term uncle and these things, you can draw out the fact that it was actually, that he was actually a cousin of Mordecai. And he either adopted her or treated her as if he had adopted her as his own daughter. Imagine that. Jenny's mom was an identical twin. And at a very early age, her mother realized that she couldn't take care of them. And Jenny's grandmother, their grandmother, get that right? Their grandmother adopted, what was it, 4 kids, all under the age of 5. Imagine that. And you know, they were already grandparents. I'll tell you one thing. If Jenny told me tomorrow that she's pregnant, I'm just gonna keel over and die. I'm gonna have a heart attack. I'm too old to chase those little kids around. Imagine the love that it would take to take on that responsibility. And yet, is it not something that families should do? Daughter. This word daughter was used in ancient times, not just among the Hebrews, but among a lot of the nations with a wide variety of meanings. It's not like us today. Today we say, well, it's a daughter. Then Maya, our granddaughter, well, she's a granddaughter. To my daughter, she's her daughter. We make distinctions like that. They didn't make those distinctions in those times. A son could be any relationship in that family. So could a daughter. And that's the way they use that term. So it's a very relative term. The word father was used in the same way by the Hebrews and also many of these nations. Well, let's look at the description of Esther. First of all, the word to'ar is used to describe that she, in figure or appearance, was beautiful. That is, her shape, her form, her outline, her figure, outward appearance was beautiful. But look at the word beautiful. You ever wondered, as you read through Esther, you ever wondered why did he use the word fair and then right behind it beautiful? Well, there's a reason. Because in the original language, beautiful is tobeh. It's good in the widest sense of the word. She's a good person, in other words. She's good, she's pleasant, she's agreeable. You see, what the text is showing us is that Esther was not just beautiful on the outside, she was beautiful on the inside. Isn't that interesting? Winters says that Esther was a perfectly formed woman, beautiful both in appearance and personality. And that's what the original language is showing us. Esther was what we would probably term today, you hear people say, that person sure is easy to look at. Jenny Elvis wasn't either. But she'll come back with me, Shania Twain. Okay. Easy to look at outwardly, but outwardly isn't important, is it? What's really important is what's on the inside. But she was pleasing to look at. And she was a person who outwardly fit her inward possession of pleasantness and agreeableness. A good person. It's better to have an ugly mate, someone said, who is beautiful on the inside than a beautiful one who is ugly or outside and who is beautiful or who is ugly. Let me start over. It is better to have an ugly mate who is beautiful on the inside than a beautiful one who is ugly on the inside. That reminds me of a 60s song, doesn't it you? Those of you who are that old. There was a song that they sang and they was talking about a beautiful woman, and this guy saying, boy, your wife sure is ugly. And he said, oh, she's ugly, but she sure can cook. Well, that's what that phrase kind of reminds me of. And when we think about all that the scriptures say. Go back into the book of Proverbs and look at how many times it says things like, better to live on a rooftop by yourself rather than with an ugly wife. It's not talking about her beauty outside. It's talking about her insides. Mordecai's compassion is seen in his care for this beautiful lady. And God has always commanded the care of orphans and widows, hasn't he? It fills the Old Testament. He gave laws to the Jews about caring for those who could not care for themselves. Now notice that. Notice the way I said that. To care for those who could not care for themselves. In the New Testament, we're told pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this. To do what? To visit the fatherless and widows. It's not talking about going by and saying, hey, how you doing today? Having a little friendly conversation. That's talking about taking care of them. The word visit there means to help them in their time of need. I'm not talking about going by and, hi, how you doing? Have a little pleasant conversation and go on. In their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. We're told that if a man will not take care of his own, he's what? Worse than an infidel. That is, somebody who doesn't even believe in God in the first place, or the God of heaven. We're to care for our families. We're to care for others. Mordecai did exactly that. He took care of this girl who had no parents. Apparently no older siblings to take care of her. From all appearances, it appears that possibly she was the only child in that family. Look at verses 8 through 9. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for her purification, which things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Notice, many of these maidens, of these virgins, were brought to Shushan so the king could take his choice. They're placed in the care of a man who may or may not be, chief eunuch of the king's harem. And notice something, Esther quickly gained the favor of this man. Why shouldn't she? We've already been told that she was beautiful not only on the outside, but on the inside. Such a person is going to gain favor with others, or maybe jealousy by some. But generally speaking, they're going to be able to get along with it. People are going to gravitate to this kind of a person. And he provided everything that she needed for this purification process. And notice that he did it quickly. Didn't hesitate, didn't wait for the supply chain to come down, didn't wait for the invoices to get to the right place, to get the product to give to her, and blah, blah, blah. He gave her 7 handmaids too. What's that? These are basically her slaves, her servants. They are to tend to her needs, to care for her, to do whatever she needs done. And it's probably one of these women who later we're going to see carrying messages for her to Mordecai. Now, some of those messages are going to be carried by a man. But some of them were probably carried by these ladies. And notice something else. He continued to show his favor for them because he moved them into the choicest place in the house of the women, this subdivision of the harem. God is working to save his people. That is the primary lesson we have to get from this book. Oh, there are a lot of lessons, but the primary one is that God is working to save his people. And he's going to work through Esther. She had indeed been brought to the kingdom for such a time as this. Esther 4:14. Those who prepare themselves to serve God, they're ready when God calls. When God, through providence, even providence is done today, when God's providence provides the possibility, those who prepare themselves to serve him to the very best of his ability will become the instrument that God uses to provide salvation for another. Our time is gone. I hope we've presented some things that will help all of us to think a little more about the book of Esther. It's a fascinating book. One of the most interesting facets of this book to me. Are you ready for this? God, the word God, never appears. Never appears in this book. But it cannot be denied that his providence is seen throughout the book. It's there. And it cannot be denied. We'll come back next week and begin with Esther chapter 2 and verse 10.